Bob Herbert's OpEd.tv is made possible in part by the CUNY TV Foundation with the support of Ann Ulnick. Hi, I'm Bob Herbert. Welcome to OpEd.tv. 75 years ago, Jackie Robinson was brought up from the minor leagues by the Brooklyn Dodgers and thus became the first African American to play Major League Baseball in the modern era. It proved to be one of the most historic, far-reaching events of the 20th century. This year is also the 50th anniversary of Jackie's death. Even though I was a New York Giants fan when I was a child, I came, not surprisingly, to have enormous respect for Robinson, who was truly great as a ball player, as a human being, as a pioneer, and ultimately, tragically, as a martyr in the endless fight against racism and injustice in America. He was only 53 years old when he died. Now comes a new book about Jackie, and it's a warm and wonderful read, so full of insights and new material that we are going to devote 2 programs to a discussion with its author. The book is called True: The 4 Seasons of Jackie Robinson, and the author is the veteran award-winning sports chronicler, Kostya Kennedy. Kostya, welcome.
Bob, great to be on with you.
Thanks for being here. Really appreciate it. We've had so many books, movies, documentaries about Jackie Robinson. Why did you want to write another book about him? What did you think you could contribute?
Yeah, well, it had been sort of germinating up there for a while, and certainly I was familiar with a lot of that Jackie stuff. I'd worked at Sports Illustrated and reviewed a couple of books, and so I began just thinking that maybe there was a way in. And in about 2013 or so, I did a story on Rachel Robinson for Sports Illustrated.
Jackie's wife.
Jackie's wife, right, his widow, who's still with us at age 100. And she was so impressive at that time, and I really got to speak with her and then developed a little bit of a professional relationship with her and her kids in terms of we would do some book events and stuff together. And I began to see that there was something else there. There was a way in to this story, and I felt I could tell some things that had been sort of underexposed, and bring him to life in a way that hadn't been done. And that's not to say, you know, there's wonderful other books. It's nothing about. Mm-hmm. But I wasn't really interested in doing the full, total soup to nuts biography. But I felt there were areas and aspects of his life that had been either overlooked, or if not entirely overlooked, underreported or underpresented.
So, you know, your title, The 4 Seasons of Jackie Robinson, so there's 4 years that you've selected that were representative of the story that you wanted to tell. And in season 1, it's 1946, which is actually the year before he was brought up to the Dodgers. And he's playing in Canada, in Montreal, for the Montreal Royals, in the then all-white International League.
Yep.
And the Royals were a farm club of the Dodgers. So tell us a little bit about that season.
Yeah, so just before I start that, I just want to say that the seasons are actual seasons, as you point out, and they're also just metaphorically the spring, summer, autumn, and winter of his public life.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so 46 really, you know, metaphorically being the spring, it's his first year in professional ball. He did play 45 games in the Negro Leagues, Kansas City Monarchs, so he was in professional ball there, but it was part of a season. He was now joining the Dodgers organization. Here was an area that I felt people certainly knew, and it was no secret that he had begun in Montreal, but the life there, and I really got a sense of this again talking with Rachel, was so critical to them that year before 1947 when he would come to Brooklyn, to get him acclimated to being a black man in an all-white baseball environment, and also just to get used to him being the sort of elevated superstar that he was. He'd been a star athlete at UCLA, so he knew about getting attention and all that.
In a number of sports.
In a number of sports, absolutely, yes. But to be sort of, here's Jackie Robinson up and have the whole crowd stand up, have people coming out to see him, having them stopped in the streets, all of those things that would prepare him for essentially a lifetime of that, and certainly a major league career of that. It was crucial those years in Montreal, and I felt it was an opportunity to show him in a sort of a little bit of an unrefined state.
So how was he received in Montreal? Because they had not seen a black ball player on their team prior to that.
Yeah.
How did his teammates receive him, and what was the reception from the fans?
So I say that the teammate response was initially cautious. And it's hard to categorize all the teammates, right? There's 25 guys, and so some people thought this and some people thought that. But once Robinson started playing the way he played, it changed everything. People saw the kind of player he was, saw the way he would contribute to the team. He talked about his first game that he played for Montreal, which was actually in Jersey City against the Giants.
The Jersey City
The Jersey City Giants, exactly, with a top farm club of the New York Giants. And in his first game, he hit a home run and he bunted for a hit and he danced down third base. And he said, that was the day that I was completely accepted by my teammates, Northerners and Southerners alike.
Wow.
Because they could, it's kind of a pretty absolute judgment sometimes in sports. If you can help me win, man, I'm all in. And so they appreciated the intensity with which he played, and he was a great teammate. So all of those things helped with the teammates.
So it's no secret about the level of racism in the United States back in the mid-40s and on into the 50s. But Jackie and Rachel actually loved living in Montreal, according to your book. Why did they like it so much?
So there was certainly aspects of racism and sort of suppression of black advancement in Canada, without question.
Mm-hmm.
But there was not the explicit type of racism. There was no segregation. It just wasn't as bright a line or big an issue in Canada and Montreal. Just as an aside for perspective, far more of a divide with the religious and language, French, English. There was far more tension.
They had their own issues.
White. Yeah. So it wasn't completely unusual to see blacks and whites, at a coffee shop together or mixing together in a way. And they loved their time there. They were embraced. They were embraced locally on their block. They lived in a French-speaking part of town, all Caucasian except for them. Rachel became pregnant that year, and the women in her apartment building and around on the streets would give her extra ration cards. Remember, we're just coming out of World War II. There was still rationing of meat and sugar. And in the streets, too, at the ballpark, it was a big deal. They loved having Jackie Robinson. There was also, I think, a level of pride. We don't have that here.
Right, exactly.
A little maybe oversimplifying, but that's what they were saying.
Kind of a sense of superiority. We don't have the same kind of racial strife here in Canada.
And there was, I had a chance to speak to people who are still with us, who went to see him in those years, people from the African American or African Canadian community, and as well as Caucasian. They went to a black church while they were there, but really mixed pretty seamlessly. And when you look back at that time, I think it was almost a source of pride. And plus, and this doesn't hurt, the team was doing great. And Jackie was doing great on the field. So people loved him.
You make the point that there was a stark difference between the environment when he was playing his home games in Montreal and when the team went on the road. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so this was the International League, as you alluded to, a minor league, top farm teams basically for all the major league teams. So the Newark Bears were also in that league, who had Yogi Berra and a number of other players. And you would go as far down as Baltimore and into Syracuse and Buffalo. And whenever you came into America, it was harder. Baltimore was a particularly tough town for them, and very difficult for Rachel, where there was still Jim Crow seating. He couldn't stay in the hotel with the team. That was even true in Buffalo and Syracuse. Even though it wasn't illegal, it was sort of culturally accepted that he wasn't going to sit with his teammate. This is why, Bob, at the very beginning of the season, he actually had a fellow black teammate who didn't last simply because he wasn't good enough to play, but they thought it would help soften things for Jackie. But that only lasted a couple of weeks, and then he was on his own. The worst instance of him coming to America in the Montreal Royals was they made it to the Junior World Series, as it was called then, and they played the Louisville Colonels and had to go down to Louisville. And
That was a rough town in those days.
Oh, and he really had a hard time. They played the first 3 games of that World Series down in Louisville. Again, Jim Crow stand, people who came from miles and miles and miles to see Jackie Robinson. But they were so vicious to him, and it really affected his play. It was one of the only times that you really saw him, and he acknowledged it. I don't want to say he was frightened, but he was unnerved by the intensity. And when they came back, he didn't play well the first few games, and they lost a couple of them, and then they come back up to Montreal, and huge welcoming for Robinson and the team. And when the Louisville Colonels started coming out, Montreal is generally a pretty polite town, sports-wise, or at least was then, a little like the way St. Louis Cardinals are now. You know, you don't really boo the opponent, but they booed those Louisville Colonels.
Is that right?
They'd read in the paper the way they treated Jackie Robinson. They did not like it one bit.
Right.
And Robinson talked about how he heard that booing and he knew that it was for him and that it meant something to him.
So you've mentioned Rachel a couple of times, and it's no secret that she was this fabulous support system for Robinson throughout their time together. Talk a little bit, this was very early in their relationship. How did they meet, and what was their relationship like in those very early years?
So they met on the campus of UCLA in the 1940s.
She was a student.
She was a student, and he was a student. So Robinson had gone to Pasadena Junior College for a couple of years, and then he went to UCLA. And they met in about 43, 44 on campus, and they began dating. And they stayed together in touch even when Robinson went into the Army, which he did, and got out in 1945. And they maintained a relationship. She, you know, when they met, she talks about, like, everybody knew who Jackie Robinson was. He was kind of a big man on campus then. But she was sort of having none of that. I mean, she you know, she liked how he looked and liked how he was and everything, but was immediately frank and open. And when he was given this opportunity, when the Dodgers offered to sign him, I mean, one of the things that Branch Rickey, the Dodgers general manager, said to him is, "Do you have a woman in your life?" And he said yes, and he was like, "Well, you're going to need her."
You're going to need her, right?
And then he, of course, went to Rachel right away, and they got married in Los Angeles in 1946, in February of 46, just a couple of months before they would begin this journey in Montreal. And yes, she'd grown up in LA, and he'd grown up in Pasadena, so they came from the same sort of matrix at home.
So in part 2, the year is 1949. And this is the summer season in your book. And he had some struggles, even though he did really well in the International League, but he had some struggles, especially in the beginning, and then he turned that around. In 1949, he was decidedly not struggling. He was, in fact, the best player in the National League. So, but what I always found this really interesting. He had come to this agreement that in his first 2 years in the majors, he came up in 1947, in the first 2 years, he would keep a tight rein on his temper. And this is a guy who had a real temper. But he would not fight back. He didn't argue with umpires. They were throwing at his head. Pitchers were throwing at his head. If he got hit by a pitch, he would just turn around and trot down to first base. So he did keep his part of the agreement. That changed in 1949. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so exactly as you're describing, after those 2 years, where he had been a productive player, he won Rookie of the Year in 1947, very nice year in 1948. But in that spring training, he decided he wasn't going to be able to do this anymore, and he needed to kind of be himself. Now, just a little background, when he played with the Kansas City Monarchs, he was known as a fire plug, right? There was I came across something from a teammate Othello Renfro, said he was up to his neck in every game.
Oh my goodness.
And he was really intense player, beyond the umpires, very engaged. So it was sort of a return to self for him. And he told Branch Rickey, listen, I'm going to do this. And Branch Rickey supported that. And then he said to reporters at spring training, well, they better be rough on me this year because I'm going to be rough on them.
Wow.
And we saw a new Jackie that year. Vocal on the field, aggressive in sliding, aggressive in every sense that you can be aggressive on the ball field. Not a dirty player by any means.
No, he never
but an
was.
intensity, never was.
Yeah.
But you didn't like playing against him because he was tough to play against.
You didn't like rooting against him either. Like I said, I was a Giants fan. I hated what Jackie Robinson did to the Giants.
So he sort of he just came into his own, Bob, and it stayed that way for he had a series of about 5 really elite seasons.
Wow.
And that was his new characteristic. And I just want to say that so by 49, part of the reason why he could do that was he was not the only one. But it wasn't as if blacks had poured into the league.
Right.
It wasn't until halfway through 49, playing against your Giants,
Yeah.
who had Monty Irvin at that point and Hank Thompson. That was the first time that he was ever in a game where the opposing team also had
Is
a
that
black
right?
player.
Wow.
So it took 2.5 years just to get to there, and it was still a great minority. So that was the environment.
So I think by that time Roy Campanella was on the Dodgers. Were they the only 2 black players on the Dodgers?
No, they had Don Newcomb as well.
He was there in 49.
49, yep. That was the year he kind of came up and came in. So those were the 3. I'm not sure if Jim Gilliam came up briefly in 49 or not.
So what I wanted to get to was, so you have these 3 black players on the Dodgers. Spring training is down south. The Dodgers are in Florida, but also it's not just in Florida. They have to go really into the deep south. Can you talk a little bit about what it was like for, in this case, the 3 black players on the Dodgers, playing in Florida and other parts of the South that were even worse than Florida during spring training?
I mean, it was just a complete challenge every day. In some ways, being at their home field, where they had to go to separate places to eat. They couldn't stay in the team
Even in
hotel.
Florida.
Even in Florida.
Yeah.
Not on the Dodgers compound. But
Right.
as soon as they stepped out
Yeah.
of that, they stayed with families or in other places besides the main hotel. That became manageable because what else was it going to be? But they had to do it. Then they would sort of come up, as you mentioned, throughout the South. At the end of spring training, on the way up, and many teams did this. This is a part of, there wasn't as much baseball down south then. So they'd sort of barnstorm their way up to Brooklyn, in the Dodgers' case, and play games against different
Right.
teams along the way. And that could be really tough. There were tough times in Beaumont, Texas.
Oh my goodness.
It was just, in Georgia's where he got a lot of death threats, and that's where the famous quote from, sometimes given to Pee Wee Reese, but it was Gene Hermansky, says, well, why don't we all wear number 42 and they won't be able to tell us apart.
That's a great line.
Yeah.
And so ironic, or I don't know if ironic is the word, but now they all do wear 42 on Jackie Robinson.
no
Day.
name
It's
on the
kind of
back.
funny with no name on
Yeah,
the back,
exactly.
right? That's wonderful.
So it was, but Robinson, he was very sort of stoic. He was never, whatever death threat he got, he was never going to question that he was going to go out on the field and he was
Right.
going to do it. That was his way. And so was Campanella. Campanella was a quieter player, but also had a tremendous resolve. Particularly as they got a little older, Jackie was not afraid to make waves.
right.
Campanella more reserved. Newcomb was a really interesting character, and he, just to talk about there was still, in St. Louis in the major leagues, was still a time where they had to stay in different hotels.
Right.
That was, I think, the only town by 1949 where that was the case. And Newcomb would talk about it and say to Jackie how, so the bus would come and drop them off, one part of town, Jackie, Newcomb, Campanella, and the rest of the teammates just stayed on the bus.
Yep.
And he never quite forgave them for that. in a way, and then they went to their hotel.
And I could understand that. I mean,
Yeah.
not a word of protest, not a peep. It's like, this is just the way it is.
Ultimately, Robinson integrated the Chase Hotel in St. Louis and,
Right.
and was, little bits of pioneering go on all along the route,
Right.
when you're somebody like that.
Yeah, because all of this was new.
Yeah.
It's a new page, not just in baseball history, but in American history.
And it's an interesting thing, and you probably have thoughts on it. Robinson wanted to go to that hotel, and he went, even when they were sort of saying, okay, you can stay here, but don't really be around the lobby or whatever.
Right.
He still went and stayed, and then he'd show up where he showed up. Newcomb said no.
Right.
They wouldn't have me before. Now, just I'm a ball player, I'm not going.
But you made the point in your book where Robinson essentially had the attitude that at some point you have to break down this barrier, and so he's going to do it.
That's what he felt. He just felt that.
He integrated that hotel.
Yeah, he felt that's what you do, and then, 6 months later, there's another black family staying there, and then, and time go, and it'll happen, right? And that was his belief anyway, to go and make the change, even if it's imperfect.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's an understatement to say that Robinson had a good year in 1949.
Yeah.
Tell us just how good it was.
Oh, well, he was, as you mentioned, best player in the National League, American League, best player alive. He was, by today's advanced metrics, there's something called WAR, which is wins above replacement, which people look back and it's supposed to say, like, how much better you are than essentially an average player.
Right.
And he led all of baseball in that figure. That year, he hit 342, and he stole 37 bases, 65 extra base hits. Since that time, it's now 75 years, you said, nobody is at over 340 with more than 35 steals and more than 60 extra base hits. Nobody. So that tells you what kind of a special year it was. And he carried that team, and they went, he was also in the All-Star game in Ebbets Field that year, which is another reason why it's such an interesting year to write about. And he took the team to the World Series. They met the still invincible Yankees at that point.
Always the Yankees.
But an incredible year where it elevated his respect and everything around the league. It can't be overstated that the level at which he succeeded is not irrelevant to his success in general integration and general acceptance and all of that.
One of the people you quote extensively in your book is Ira Glasser, who I've known well, and for a long time he was the executive director of the American Civil Liberties Union.
Yep.
You're interviewing him, and he's reflecting on his days as a youngster. Talk about that and explain why you gave Ira Glasser such a prominent role in your story.
Yeah, so I was a wonderful figure and man who gave his life to civil rights, as you said, head of the ACLU. And at a time when, I first met Ira, I first spent time with him when he went to a ball game with William Buckley, who was the chief conservative.
All right, I didn't know about that. That is like so strange.
So, well, they used to argue on firing line. He found out Buckley had never been to a baseball game.
I figures.
Come on. But it speaks to one of the things I respect about Ira, like let's talk.
Yep.
And that doesn't happen so much anymore, right? There was a time when he was ready to say, let's get somewhere. So he grew up in Brooklyn, and he was a huge Dodger fan. And the thing that he articulates so well, and I think he's a stand-in for lots of other people, there was no segregation in Brooklyn, but still, he was sort of a Reformed Jewish white family, and he didn't live near any Italians or Irish or blacks or then
you didn't have segregation in New York City in those days, but you did have these ethnic neighborhoods.
Exactly.
So it would be mostly Italian Americans in one neighborhood, mostly Jews in another neighborhood, mostly blacks, et cetera.
Exactly. So for him, it was almost like a segregation. You just saw the same types of people every day when you went to school, when you went to the store, whatever you did. And he would talk about being at Ebbets Field, and now here's a black family next to him, and you're all cheering together. Like, honestly, was there a more integrated place in America than Ebbets Field in 1949? And you're cheering when Robinson does something well, or when Duke Snyder does something well, or when Roy Campanella, or when Pee Wee Reese, whether it's a black person or a white person, you're cheering together and sometimes maybe embracing when something happened. And he felt that environment, as well as Robinson was a hero among heroes. It's a fabled team that gets written about. Again, I mentioned Snyder, Reese, Campanella. Robinson was so elevated. They used to imitate the way he stood at the bat. And when Ira would hear Red Barber describing some of the stuff we were just talking about happening in St. Louis. Oh, well, they wouldn't let Robinson stay in the hotel. He was incensed. And he didn't even know, as he describes it, it wasn't, in a way, it was more effective than going to school and having a teacher say, and there's segregation and that's bad because, which they didn't even do then. They didn't teach it then. But he's learning it on the most visceral level. That's not okay. That's my guy. You can't, what do you mean you're not letting him? So the impact that Robinson had on Ira Glassman, he will say, if you say who was the most impactful person while you went to the job, he say it now as he would have said any time in the past 50 years, Jackie Robinson.
Jackie Robinson.
And there's a cohort of guys who Ira connected me with who are like that and grew up as Dodger fans, and it had a big impact on their life. Right? Some became poverty lawyers or other types of work like that.
So we're going to have to stop here because we've run out of time, but we will continue this discussion on our next program. We're talking with Kostya Kennedy, author of True, The 4 Seasons of Jackie Robinson. Tune in next time, and this time, thanks for watching. I'm Bob Herbert.